I just felt those blissful, loving, like ineffable, sublime feelings. And then I saw this pinprick of light, at which point, as I looked at that light, it started getting bigger. I realized, oh my gosh, I'm dying. And I also had the realization I've been here hundreds and hundred times before. Like this was not new.
Yes, William. So thank you for accepting my invitation to be on our podcast. So William is a licensed grief and bereavement psychotherapist and the founder of the Shared Crossing Project, whose mission is to collect and study end-of-life experiences, which he also referred to as shared crossings. You are the author of the book At Heaven's Door, which I've got my copy right here. And you're recognized as the world's leading authority on shared death experiences, which, for those who don't know, occur when a living person reports experiencing elements of someone else's near-death experience, even though they themselves are not dying. So thank you, William, for giving me a chance to speak to you today. And I wanted to start by asking you to perhaps share your NDE during your ski accident when you were 17, which I assume is what prepared you for this interesting life direction.
Yeah, I think you're correct in that. I don't think, but for having that experience, I can't see a path by which I would be so diligent in studying the shared death experience and sharing what we've learned with the world. And you're right. I think it did start with my near death experience. 17 years old, really just, having a typical ski day in Lake Tahoe, California, and was going down the mountain pretty quickly. And I caught an edge, which is not uncommon. And I caught an edge in the back of my skis. Then I kind of tried to mid-course correct, as they say, and that crossed up the front of my skis. And then I catapulted and flew in the air. And when I landed, I somersaulted, and my skis did not come off. And they actually, because of the somersault, the backs of my skis kind of lodged into the snow. And as I somersaulted, they kept me from going forward. And my low back, my lumbars 4, 5, and then sacrum 1 crunched, just squished together, which is called a lumbar compression fracture. And in that moment, um, and you can obviously die with that type of pressure to your low back. I mean, as my orthopedic surgeon told me, you were 1/32nd of an inch away from being a paraplegic. That means paralyzed from my waist down. And any more than that, he said, I don't know if you'd still be here.
Mm.
So it was a true near-death experience in terms of the physical medical assessment of how close I was to death. But in that moment, I remember the compression, the crunch, and everything going dark. Uh, and it was like, and then I realized that there was silence, and a silence like I had never heard before, as if to say, before I knew that silence, I never knew there was a buzz or a hum in my energetic body. I never knew that my body was really energetic in that way, and I really, there was the sound that went away of the humming electrical mechanism of a physical body. In that moment, I had mindfulness, as I would call it, like my consciousness was aware of everything. I was still had a sense of self, and I was paused for a second, and then very quickly, I felt a huge, like, gravitational pull upwards that was comfortable, and I just moved away from the earth very quickly. And at that point, I was very enamored. I looked at beautiful Lake Tahoe, I looked at San Francisco Bay Area, Colorado Rockies, and then a satellite view of our beautiful planet Earth. And then I was enthralled by the solar system, the galaxy of just, countless stars and beauty. And at that same time, my life was being reviewed. Every moment in my previous 17 years. And I do remember that seeing scenes of selfishness or unkindness and realizing, wow, I need to do better if I'm gonna. At that point, I had no idea where I was headed, but at some point I realized, wow, that wasn't so good. I wasn't so kind there. It's kind of like a karmic lesson right away. And I also realized how each action impacted others. Like I was, I kind of was mean to one of my neighbors. This is like 5 years old. I took his bike. He started crying. He ran into his mom. He upset his mom. His mom got upset with him, then got upset with the husband. The husband had, it just kind of trickled on. And I realized, oh boy, there's karma. So I was learning right away from my life review. And then I found myself in this tunnel. And then I saw this pinprick of light, at which point, as I looked at that light, it started getting bigger. I realized, oh my gosh, I'm dying. And I also had the realization I've been here hundreds and hundred times before. Like this was not new. And then I had at the same time the realization I I did not complete what I came into this incarnation to complete. I had no idea what that was. No idea what that was. I just realized I had not finished this human mission, if there was such a thing. But I did enter fully into the light, and I did, as I was approaching that light, plead with God to say, please let me go back. I didn't finish what I came here to do. Then when I entered into the light, fully into the light, I just felt those blissful, loving, like ineffable, sublime feelings. And I remember, saying kind of to myself, kind of out loud, it's like, I'm good. I don't need to go back. I'm fine. And then I felt this push on my body, gravitational, energetic, and I realized I was leaving the light. And I did say, thank you, God, because he did, he, she, they, whatever that is, um, did grant my wish as previously spoken. And then I had this realization. I want to say that I can't say that I heard the words, but there was something communicated to me, maybe telepathically, make something of your life. And that was a really um, profound words, profound message that I had no idea at that point what it meant, except that in my own way, I realized that life review was telling me that's not the way I need to be living. Of course, I was only 17 years old, so who has a really, great, kind, loving self? Maybe there are some people, but I was not one of them at that point. Um, so I returned to planet Earth, and landed back in my body on that ski slope, and and I was covered in snow, and then my friend who I was skiing with came up really close to me, sprayed me, with snow, because that's what we did, spraying each other. And he said, "Wow, dude, that was a wipeout." And that experience left my mind. Like I don't ever remember thinking of it in any conscious, reflective, integrative way, until like really a couple decades later. I mean, I remember learning about the SDE about 10 years later. Um, Watching television and hearing a movie star, I think it was Francis Ford Coppola actually, who had a near-death experience. He was talking about it, and I heard rib tunnel and light as I was channel surfing, and I said, "Ooh, that's interesting." And I came back, I listened to it, and my body started shaking. I said, "Oh my God, I had what he had." I know that. Who is this guy? What is this thing? And that's when I learned that I had the near-death experience. But I still didn't do a whole lot with it. I wasn't at all connected to, the movement that had, begun, about 10 to 15 years earlier with IANDS and, Raymond Moody and Life After Life and what have you. So that was my first NDE.
Wow, always well, amazing stories, really. So I know you had another one when you were 30 years old. Would you like to briefly share that one as well?
Yeah, so that was, I was just doing my life. I was run down. I was a teacher teaching middle school students. I was actually teaching in Spanish and, and in English, and what it was just a tough school, and I was tired. And this one afternoon, I had just done a workout. It was winter time. It was February, little cool outside, and I just remember being so tired, and I looked down at my hands and my body as I was putting on my after I got out of the shower, I dried off, I was putting my clothes back on, and I realized I had pinpricks of that looked like like red pinpricks all over my arms, and then I realized they were all over my legs, and I took out before I put my shirt, I said, "It's all over my body." I called my brother who's a doctor and told him, and he said, "You gotta go to the emergency room right away." So I did, and when I got to the emergency room, they immediately put me in a in a room with a fall alert on it, like, they just and I passed out. And the next thing I remember coming to was I was above the ICU, and I was listening to nurses talking. It was the middle of the night. Keep in mind, I arrived at probably in the afternoon sometime, like 3 in the afternoon, maybe checked into the hospital around 4, and at that point, it was the middle of the night, somewhere between 12 and 4 in the morning, and I was listening to the nurses talk about various things, their love life and what have you, and, as nurses do in the middle of the night, and then they were going through, the 4 people that were in this ICU in their area, and they described this, one guy who had a heart attack who wasn't gonna make it through the night, they didn't think. Another woman had a stroke, and she wasn't doing so well. Then there was this guy in bed 3. They said, "We don't know what's going on with him. He's super healthy. He's, like, I think he was like 30 years old or something, um, and we don't know why he's here. He's got idiopathic thrombocytopenia, which is very low platelets, which you can die from. You can drown in your blood. So that's why I was in the ICU. When they said it about this 30-year-old guy, I thought that's interesting. I wonder who he is. So I said, I'm 30 years old. I'm thinking, and that's what's going on. So I moved my, consciousness, whatever that is, over to just above that bed. And I looked at the face of this guy, I said, "Oh, holy whatever. That's me. What am I doing down there?" And and, and I go, what the heck? And then I just said, "Oh well," and I didn't seem to make much of it other than my initial response. And then I traveled around more on that 10th floor of the ICU, and I just like checking things out. I remember seeing janitors talking, and hiding in the closet. I remember one janitor was hiding in the closet. It was so funny to see life in a hospital late at night. But then the hematologist came in and tapped on my arm, and that got my attention, but from up above. And he said, Mr. Peters, I'm Doctor whatever. Um, and I remember listening to him from above saying, "Do I want to answer him or not?" And I thought to myself, well, if I answer him, what's going to happen? Or how would I answer him? I had all these questions about like, can I even answer him? But my eyes were shut. I was asleep from what I could tell, but I did answer him. I said, I'll try. And as I answered him, it felt like sand in an hourglass filling in my body. Like energy started coming back on in my body. Like, like warm water in a underneath the shower. It's like you start feeling more sensation. And that's what happened to me as I started to talk. And I remember saying, kind of struggling for words, I said something like, yes. So I was almost kind of coming back into my body and in a certain way, reacquainting myself with the physical apparatus of my body. I mean, it came back very quickly, but I was definitely had an out of body experience. And then, he explained to me my situation and that I was on immunogamma and da da da, and that I should be fine. And then he walked away, and then he turned around and came back, and he said to me, Mr. Peters, I think you should know something. You had about 12,000 platelets. And he said, most people would have died,
Mm.
but you did not. I just thought you would like to know that.
That's good to know.
And I think he said you had less than 12,000 platelets because they were measuring them and they were crashing. And the last time they checked me, I had 12,000 and they were trying to elevate my platelet level. So I listened to that and I just go, oh, okay. So that's my second
Yeah.
NDE, which is, as you can tell, is a very different
Yeah.
NDE. I really stayed in the earth realm and had a prolonged out of body experience.
Yeah, so almost feels as if those two NDEs were kind of your warm up practice, because I know then you started to have a number of shared that experiences. I was wondering if I know it's not your first one, but would you be able to share with our audience the one with your patient Ron when you were
Um,
volunteering at a hospice?
yeah. So I was so I got fascinated uh, in death in the late part of the 80s. Excuse me, late part of the 90s, heading into the turn of the century. So I took a job at Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco as a hospice worker. And this was a really interesting hospice because it was in a public hospital called Laguna Honda Hospital, 24-bed open ward hospice, like no separate rooms, just drapes.
Wow.
And what that meant was there were people dying all the time because this served the indigent. Think homeless people, persons with severe illnesses that the San Francisco hospitals can no longer deal with anymore. They can't help them, so they send them to the county hospital, and they know they're going to die in short order. Like this is just get them out of their wards and send them to the county hospital, to the county hospice.
Yeah.
Um, and well, for me and for the other volunteers who wanted to be close to death and help people and learn and you know experience people dying, which I did, this was a great opportunity. And so I was with, I don't even know. I mean, lots and lots and lots of deaths, sometimes multiple deaths in one shift, right at the bedside. Um, and so Ron was one of those people who actually, one of our residents who actually was there for quite some time. He was probably there for, 3 months or so, which for a hospice stay, that's pretty long. I mean, the average hospice stay typically in the United States, I think, is around, in certainly in, um, when you do outpatient hospice, excuse me, inpatient hospice is typically, a so I mean, somewhere around a dozen days in the United States.
Wow.
And I could be off on a few days on that, but the point being is a 3-month resident in a hospice of this kind was kinda rare. And that was great because I got to develop a relationship with Ron. I read to him every day that I was there, and he was a merchant marine during his life, which means he traveled all over the world. He was an adventurer, and so he loved adventure stories. So I was reading to him at that time Jack London's Call of the Wild, which is an adventure story in the Iditarod. Um, and as I was reading this to him, I suddenly popped out of my body. I mean, I just popped out of my body. I can't even explain it. And and Ron, the next thing I realized, I'm looking down at my body. I'm looking down at Ron's body. He's prone and um, unresponsive in his bed, but he's there to my right, and I can only see his head. He's smiling at me, big beautiful smile, and he's almost communicating to me something like, "Check this out. Check this out. This is where I am." And I just looked at him and said, "Whoa." Um, but he was very pleased to share this with me, although there was never really any communication other than I could tell he was pleased. But if I were to read into it, I think he was wanting to show this to me and he figured out how to do it. And so he was in a certain way granting me, um, a shared, a shared OBE, or we call it co OBE, But it's definitely part of the shared death experience because he was beginning his journey. And I would say, I'll use, I really like the way Peter Fenwick talked about death when you have these slower, gradual deaths that, the soul, spirit, consciousness starts titrating
Okay.
between the human body and what we call the afterlife.
Yeah.
And Ron was doing that. He was beginning his journey and he was sharing it with me. And he was sharing that he was okay. He was more than okay. He was overjoyed. He was so happy. And he shared it with me. And so I went back into my body, sometime later. I mean, it's funny as I remember looking down at myself reading to him, I don't ever think I stopped reading. I think I was, bilocating
Oh, so
and
you're actually an
having
autopilot somehow,
yeah.
right?
I mean,
Wow.
I was still reading and I was observing myself reading to him, but I was also fully engaged with him. So I was having two parallel reality. I was having parallel realities, um, which is fascinating and which is a part, um, of near death and share death studies, that is worthy of deep investigation as to what's happening there. Um, but I digress. So, and when I returned to my body, I stopped reading and I did stay up reading a second and I realized, what the hell was that? And then I realized, oh my God, I know that experience. I had that, during my second near death experience when I was hovering above my body in the ICU. And so I was excited and I wanted to talk to the supervisor, Eric, who was just a a superstar hospice worker. He
Mm.
he had been doing hospice since the time of the what we call the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco. So during the late 80s, all through the 90s, and now this was 2000. Um, but he'd been a hospice warrior. Like he had been at hundreds and hundreds of deaths, and gruesome deaths. And so I figured, he would know something about this. And so I went to him and I said, because I had the utmost respect for him, I said, "Hey, I got to tell you what just happened." And I shared the story with him. And we were walking down the long corridor of this 24-bed hospice that had beds on each side. It was long. And he never even stopped walking. And he looked at me and briefly and just said, "Sounds like you were between heaven and earth. Mary needs your help in bed number 3." And I'm like, "Well, this is like one of my biggest spiritual experiences and one of the people I respect most in spirituality around death and dying, because this is a Buddhist hospice. We do a lot of reflection, meditation. We focus on presence and authenticity and receptivity. This is the hallmark of the Zen hospice and Buddhist practice around death, which I believe facilitates the SDEs and other spiritual experiences. But he didn't really know about, he didn't help me with the experience at all. And so that experience just went away. And I'll just skip a little forward here and say, I didn't really talk about that experience at all until I heard Raymond Moody give a talk in 2009. I remember it as clear as day, Omega Institute. I was there to hear Raymond talk about the near-death experience, and he begins by saying, "I know you all are here because you think I'm gonna talk about the near-death experience." He says, "But I'm really gonna focus on another experience, which is identical in phenomena and features to the near-death experience, but it happens in the healthy minds and bodies of loved ones and caregivers and sometimes bystanders to the dying. And these experiences which I am coining, which I'm calling shared death experiences, occur when somebody's dying and a caregiver level and a bystanders expresses that they somehow shared in the initial stages of the afterlife for the dying. Well, when I heard that, my body just started lighting up, that energetic, you know, truth bumps, tingling. I'm like, what? I know all about this. So, of course, I remembered the experience with Ron. I remembered many other experiences I had at hospice and other people I'd worked with in Latin America, actually. And when I worked there was one in particular. I remember putting it all together like dominoes. Boom, 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 boom. I know exactly what he's talking about. So I went up to him afterwards and said, Raymond, oh no, I said Dr. Moody at that time. I just met him. So Dr. Moody, um, I had all these experiences. And is anybody doing research on this? And he looked at me and says, no, no one that I know of is doing research on the shared death experience. And I said, well, I would like to. I mean, I've had these experiences. I even think I know I can help people have them. I mean, I had this kind of download. I think I can help people have them, which is really what the Shared Crossing Project started with. Was I assumed once people heard about the Shared Crossing Project, everybody who had a dying loved one would come in to my psychotherapy office and say, I want to learn how to have the shared death experience. Well, as we learned, people needed more time to learn about the SDE before they would sign up for programs and want to learn how to do that. Anyway, so Raymond, offered his support, and that began the relationship with Raymond. And he was a huge advocate. In fact, he came out to Santa Barbara, California a couple of years later. That's where I live. And we were kicking off the Shared Crossing Research Initiative. And he came out to Santa Barbara and he was so generous. We had like a lot of different gatherings in Santa over 4 days. We had gatherings, up to I think 500 people showed up at a number, and it was just, and this was the way we kicked off the Share Crossing Research Initiative and big fundraising event and all the rest of it to get us started. So so that tells you a little bit about taking it forward in terms of how the research initiative and the project started.
Hello there. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed part 1 of the interview. The full episode will be posted in a few weeks as part of our YouTube membership program. So subscribe if you haven't already to stay up to date, and join us then for the rest of the conversation and many more exclusive interviews with some of the biggest names in the field of near-death studies and beyond. Bye for now.